So I talked a little bit about price, and we already touched on it for a moment, but let's sort of spend a little bit of time here with, when is a game free? And, certainly lots of games, they're free to download, but they have in-app purchase opportunities in them as part of the way in which the game is being monetized. The game is something that can be played through. The fun can be had without having to buy things in the game. Then it's certainly arguably a free game. If the game is free to download, but you can't really have a meaningful experience, make significant progress through the game without spending money, my recommendation would be to not advertise that game as free. A compromise that I've seen is free to download. It's free to download. It's not necessarily free to play, but understanding the nature of how one works their way through the game. And it's really a judgment call here. There's not hard and fast rules, but there's more sort of the ways in which the winds are blowing, and they're blowing generally in the direction of being more candid with consumers about whether or not this is a particular game where they can enjoy it and have all the fun that you would expect, whether you're a paying player or a non-paying player. But it is very much a judgment call. And so thinking about, are there other ways to advertise this game without just saying it's free, particularly if it does have in-app purchase opportunities. Talked a little bit about advertising in-game purchases already, but one key piece that we haven't yet talked about is just that it needs to be really clear that the in-app purchase is distinguishable from the gameplay, that it's not part of the same process, right? That it's a separate process. You're making a decision to do something intentional. The intentional thing you're choosing to do is to purchase the item. So, and that's from my perspective, very much a graphical question. How are you graphically showing that this is a different experience that the consumer is opting to move into, in other words, making the purchase within the game? Talking about those in-app purchases, wherever they might be, whether they're in an app or in a console game, I want to talk about the pricing of those purchases. And we have in the clothing space pretty well-developed body of case law around reference pricing. And reference pricing being, this is a lower price, it's 50% off, it's 75% off, those sorts of terms and language. You see that in video games as well, where certain aspects of the game are advertised as half off today, July 4th special, 75% off, whatever the thing is, gold, gems, packs, whatever the item for purchase might be. And there is body of case law and statutes in California to be thought about in terms of whether or not something actually is a former price. And that's the question. That's the legal question. Is this thing really 70% off? Have you ever sold it at the higher price such that it's truthful to say that you're now discounting the price? And yeah, Vinita, I'm going to unmute you. Can you tell us all your question, and then I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. This is just going back to where you were talking about. Can you hear me? This is just about where you were going back, talking about the, in-app purchases. We had a question come up because, I think not just EA, but other game companies often refer, kind of characterize the frequency or not of when you may get a certain type of item in a loot box. And so I'm just wondering if terms like rare or unlikely or words like that need further clarification so that consumers know what the odds really are, or whether or not there's any sort of disclosures required around terms like that.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful for the consumer to have sort of a standard lexicon for whatever the game is in terms of, whether or not an item is legendary or rare or super rare, whatever the terminology specifically is. But, certainly for apps, there's a requirement that you disclose the odds of getting a thing. And so if, for instance, someone is buying something to get the odds of getting a legendary weapon, and the weapon has a name, Kim's sword, and the odds of getting that are 1 in 100, the expectation would be that you would lay that out somewhere, that calling it rare isn't likely to be a sufficient disclosure for the purposes of calling out the odds. But maybe it's just rare items, and there's a good lexicon. There's a 1 in 100 chance of getting any item that's rare, and maybe it's 1 in 50 of getting something that's unique. And so if someone's not trying to get that specific item, then in that case, disclosing the odds for a class or category would be sufficient. I'm going to go back to our reference pricing real quick, and thank you for the questions. Happy to keep taking them. So we were talking about discounted items and calling something half off, 70% off, and you do need to set some standards. It's hard in the digital space to do that. It is hard given what the statute says, right? Within 3 months, next immediately preceding the advertisement. This is a much faster paced industry than clothing. And so the best practice here is to have good data on when a particular pack of gems, say it's 100 gems, and they're normally sold for $10, and now they're being marked off to $5, and so it's 50% off. To have good data on when it was sold for 10 and how much was sold for 10, so that you can make the credible argument and you can have the data to show that when you said it was 50% off, you really legitimately had sold that pack at that price to a significant number of consumers. And to me, this is a risky area, the discounted pricing area, because there's been a reasonable amount of litigation and comparable litigation, even though it's not showing up in the game space. So the Span versus JCPenney case, which involved JCPenney discounting its own in-house goods, obviously resulted in a very significant class action settlement. And so the issue there about the in-house goods is, in my mind, analogous to a particular game that has its own market economy and still saying this particular thing is half off, this particular thing is 75% off. And so I highlight the Span versus JCPenney case, one, to say that I do think that there is case law that could be used on the consumer class action side to start making waves with sort of reference pricing issues in the game space. And then two, to point out that not only was there a consumer class action, but there was an investigation by the Los Angeles city attorney about exactly the same advertising. And so it's just an area where there's been attention paid, discounts to consumers. And so the takeaway for reference pricing, and there's a related concept, which is compare this pack to that pack, compare this bucket of gems and weapons and other items to this bucket of gems and items and weapons, and compare the prices, all in this in-house, in market economy, right? Same market. Have good data to show that things are similar, to show that prices are really discounted, so that when we get to the area where there's a consumer class action or there's an investigation about particular pricing models in a game, the studio's in a position, the publisher's in a position to say, here's our data to show the basis for making truthful statements about the advertising having been discounted. Related to reference pricing is the idea of buy one, get one. Buy a pack, get a pack. Buy 100 gems, get 100 gems. And the problem with, say, a BOGO, buy one, get one, is, as you can see from the images here, all of the shorthand. And so the question becomes, buy one, but at what price? And, what's the regular price. You can't jack up the price to make buy one, get one really economically the same for the seller. The consumer really needs to be getting one for free. And you need to be clear on what they're getting. If they're buying 100 gems, are they getting 100 gems? If they're buying 100 gems and they're getting, a sword, is that really buy one, get one? Or do you need disclosures to make it clear what the buy one and the get one is? So the same rules that we talked about at the beginning in terms of clear and conspicuous disclosures, in terms of, what are the claims that are being made? Are you implying to your players that they're going to buy 100 gems, get 100 gems, but they're buying 100 gems and they're getting the sword? Are you going to have unhappy players? So thinking about what needs to be said about the advertising to make it truthful is obviously necessary. And BOGO I find to be challenging just because it's a shorthand and you're already in the place where you're not using full language. And so just think about how it's being presented. And there are ways to make, say, a BOGO ad for, an in-game or in-app purchase truthful.